goods and services. Let me move quickly to our third speaker. We're very happy to have an old friend back with us, Gibril Faal, and a friend of ours in both Geneva and in our office in London. He's London-based. He's currently director of a UK-based company that advises on socially responsible businesses, ethical business models and practices, Islamic finance and corporate responsibility. He is on many boards and in many agencies. He's a board member, for example, of the EC-UN Joint Migration and Development Initiative. He's also chairman of the African Foundation for Development of FORD, which I think is one of our most active observers in IOM. It's a charity that works to extend and enhance the role that diaspora can play. And he's also a founder of another group called Remit Aid, which is a program to transform remittances into a sustainable form of international development finance. He's played a very active role also in all of the civil society days that the various, the 7 or 8 global forums on migration and development have been held. Mr. Faal, you have the...
Thank you very much, Director General. It is an honor and a privilege to join you in this council meeting, being the first one since the adoption of the 2030 agenda, and an important one for IOM with the adoption of the migration governance framework, and of course the opening of the negotiations to join the UN. My comments would be focused on perhaps what approach we should use to implement the SDGs. Like many of you, there is a little bit of concern and a little bit of anxiety as to whether we would be able to live up to the aspirations reflected in the SDGs. And the concerns are legitimate indeed, because many a good policy has withered away for want of implementation. So inaction is a worry. In this area of migration and development, reversals is a serious and present worry, in that what is in the public interest is not always necessarily of interest to the public. When it comes to migration, the DG have just reminded us, within a short time, we see what I would perhaps call manufactured public consent or public interest being very narrow, being very protective, to the detriment of some of the sentiments that are in the SDGs and the whole discussion of migration and development. And sometimes I do feel sympathy for our political leaders, because of course they do need to win that public vote. And so they react to it. Unfortunately, it is to our disadvantage overall, and the public good suffers. So my reflections then focuses on what can we do within the context of those serious and present realities of possible reversals. I would suggest a number of things. First, in terms of implementing the letter of the SDGs, that I think we need to be perhaps a bit creative, because as we've heard from Ambassador Donoghue, a lot of negotiations in the very wording of the SDG have taken place, which betrays the sentiments of the progressive and perhaps not progressive sort of member states, nations in terms of these negotiations. So the wording that we have can effectively be used at a very basic level, or it can be used to open up a whole lot of good. My suggestion then is that for the implementation, we just take the literal wording as the red light. It is nothing more than the red light. We have to move. So I think we need in our individual countries to take the spirit of the SDG more importantly. And the spirit is the undeniable nexus between migration and development. If we take that spirit, it allows us to set our own targets, our own indicators that perhaps go further than what we have. Why is it important to go perhaps further than what we have? One is because it's only safer. To achieve the targets, it's safer that we try to do more, so that if we fail, we still at least hit the threshold. That's number one. Number two is that implementation is difficult. And in some countries are ahead of others in terms of what the agreements are. And the agreement of the SDG is a compromise. It is not necessarily the lowest common level, but at least it was a compromise. So we have to set our own personal targets or individual country targets. We are seeing this in the discussions now in relation to the indicators that follows from the targets. There's a sense we still do not have a very clear view as to how the indicators would be sorted out. But I would not be surprised if there would be many actors who are unhappy about the indicators that we end up having. So instead of remaining in that state of unhappiness and querying it, we as individual countries can set our own targets, make it ambitious, make it reflect the spirit rather than just the letter of an international agreement. There are other reasons why sort of this more ambitious approach in implementation is important. If you take 10.7, which I think perhaps it's the biggest category, planned and well-managed migration, you may not be surprised to know that this is susceptible to perverse interpretation. For a country that wants to interpret that as planned and well-managed, meaning control and securitization, can indeed use this agreement for that purpose. That's not the spirit of it, but the letter of it does not exclude that perverse and perhaps retrogressive interpretation. So those who support the nexus and want to see it work should normalize the benefits of migration and development by setting targets for themselves beyond what's needed, and doing it so much so that any reversals would even take us back to a threshold that's better than where we are in 2015 today. Another point is, if you take a whole category of migrants who certainly are not refugees, they are not highly skilled migrants, and these are the people who tend to find themselves in difficulty. And these are the group of people who are also extremely useful to many economies. There is no explicit, clear focus on them, and that would have been difficult to get. And I would say progressive nations should focus on this opportunity. You see, the highly skilled migrants can always look after themselves. If you take the highly skilled African footballers, no European nation now can imagine itself without them. That means it's been normalized. So even if the FA in the UK starts talking about reducing the number of foreign players in a team, even if you start working towards that, you would come at a level that is far, far better than how things were several years ago. This is what I mean by normalization. So you have to aim much higher, because we cannot guarantee that we will not suffer reversals. In fact, we can guarantee the opposite, that we will suffer reversals. But those that should not take us backwards, it should take us to a decent threshold. Another example is the 3% reduction of transaction cost on remittances by 2013. Myself particularly, I've been very unhappy about it. Ambassador Donoghue is the most lobbied man in 2015. And unfortunately, I didn't get his ear on this one. But I was arguing that 3% by 2030, I don't need that because I already have it. It's not ambitious enough. Today, in many European and North American countries, you can send remittances for less than 3%. So to set that for a target to 2030, I would say it's not ambitious. But the wording, the compromise wording we've got is to reduce to less than. So it gives us a bit of room there. Now, the Valletta, the EU-Africa Valletta Summit that just finished, there's been a lot of controversy around it, but I just want to highlight one area. That is when it came to remittances. They had accepted wording, which is in the action plan, that leaves it very open that with Europe and Africa, they may choose particular corridors and work towards a target more ambitious than what the SDGs set. So the SDGs does give us a framework, but for those of us who support the spirit, I think we do need to be far more ambitious. Last set of comments I would make is in terms of the indicators. That part is far from being settled, and I think the time scale is really between now and perhaps February, March, to get it settled. The comments I would make for the interest of member states here and the good ambassadors is this: the role of civil society in the indicators. We now know, and I don't think that will be changed, that the indicators would be monitored by the national statistical authorities. For many countries, this is the first time these authorities would be dealing with some of these interesting development indicators. So I would suggest that we push for the national statistical authorities to be independent. In some countries they are, in many they are not. So support for independence of these statistical authorities, support for capacity building of these statistical authorities, and support for a multiple membership in the governance of these authorities, so that it is not just civil servants, but businesses, civil society, academics are represented. And I would also make a point that civil society perhaps need to be supported to be able to produce their own shadow reports, as it were, dealing with different aspects of the indicators. So in sum, my contribution to this debate is we are pleased and grateful for what we have in terms of the SDGs. We had few months to wallow in it, as it were. Now the necessary anxieties have to come back, and it is good, all good anxiety, that we extract from it all the positive spirit that was behind the promulgation of the specific wording and lettering. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.